had a question recently in the comments. How do you make a reader fall in love with the main character when I myself have difficulty with it as a reader and a writer? How to make a needed character for the story and a lovable character. And they added, making this even harder, how do I achieve this in a short story or flash fiction? They said they don't think they've ever found a book where the main character is as lovable as the side characters. And that what drives them as a writer is the story first and the character second. So they write based on coming up with a plot and then, letting the characters fill in that plot rather than coming up with the characters and the characters decide the plot. And writers work various ways when it comes to whether you start with the plot or the character or even sometimes the setting or the theme or something different. I've written some books that started with the plot and I've written some that started with the character and some that were a little more of a hybrid. Did you click on this video just to tell me that Frodo is not boring? Because I agree with you and so did the original commenter, but that was shameless clickbait. Who doesn't love Frodo? I would not necessarily argue that Frodo is a little boring though. Well, we'll get into that. Anyway, my name is Lydia Foxglove and I'm a fantasy writer. I've been making my living as a writer since 2009 and I've been both traditionally published and indie published. And I actually did a video recently on how to make a boring character more interesting. I'll link that at the end of this video. But I also realized that this was a somewhat different question. That video was about how to make any character, including side characters who just aren't really working, how to make them more interesting. And this question was specifically what's up with main characters and why are they so boring? In this comment, they said that they don't know anyone whose favorite character in Harry Potter is Harry Potter. Raise your hand if your favorite character in Harry Potter is Harry Potter, because I'll admit I don't personally know anyone whose favorite character is Harry Potter. I've also heard this complaint about Bella Swan quite frequently, that she's a pretty boring character. I think when I read Twilight, the truck was the most interesting thing about Bella, in my opinion. That was her one quirky thing, is that she had an old truck. It didn't really feel like enough, especially for how many words Twilight has. And then a lot of these are they're archetypes, they're cliches. You have your farm boy who finds out that he's actually a prince. You have your tough, damaged girl who is an amazing warrior. There's so many books with these types of characters that I'm sure you already have one floating around in your mind, and many of you have different ones that you're thinking of. And a lot of them feel kind of bland. So is it possible to avoid this problem? Is it possible to make a main character who is compelling? Well, my first question is, are you mostly reading fantasy or maybe other spec fic genres? I think sci-fi has some of this as well, but everything people name is usually a fantasy or paranormal, in particular when it comes to this boring main character question. In fact, it is curious. I've often noted that the books that I reread, my absolute favorite books of all time, are mostly not fantasy. Even though I'm a fantasy writer, my favorite genre is fantasy. But the books that I revisit are usually not fantasy. Like Emily of New Moon, the Betsy Tacy series, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Little House. A lot of them are in fact semi-autobiographical, realistic fiction. And these are all main characters that I identify with, but of course they're generally based somewhat on the real lives of some writer woman of the past. So it's probably no surprise that I, as a female writer, identify with these characters. But they also have pretty interesting and nuanced personalities, interests, observations. And of course they do. They're based on real people, or they're based on, if not one real person or the author themselves, clearly drawing on their experiences, people around them. A lot of fantasy is rooted in more of a mythic structure, where it's drawing from mythology, old, sagas and fairy tales. These are not stories that are known for their incredibly nuanced characters, but are more about the hero's journey and other more archetypal, why do I not know how to say that? Story structures where the point isn't really making a really interesting, weird character. Realistic fiction does have some characters like this. It's more common to see a wide range of characters, including characters that are interesting but not likable, characters that are extremely lovable and quirky, characters that are hilarious. You just get more of a spectrum of characters when you get into more realistic fiction. And then there's other genres, like I don't really read thrillers. Mystery often is very much about like the characters. If you have like a mystery series with like one detective and kind of recurring characters, like Dorothy Sayers kind of treated her Peter Wimsey and Harriet Vane characters like they were real people, even writing like Christmas cards from them and sending them to her friends, which I really respect. So every genre has kind of like a different vibe, I think, when it comes to characters. But let's say that you are writing in fantasy, paranormal, maybe sci-fi, something that often tends to have like more of that hero's journey structure. If you're writing in kind of like a cozy fantasy or like a romance that's really focused more on character growth, kind of those genre crossovers, you might not have this problem so much. But let's say you actually are trying to write a story that is like a fantasy quest. It involves, just the typical genre quests across the realm to defeat the villain. Let's say even that you are writing that precise kind of story that comes from like mythic structures. Is it possible to make your main character the most interesting character in the story? Is it? Do I have to answer that? I guess the first point is like, do you really need to? Does it matter that Harry Potter is not as interesting as the side characters? You have a ton of characters in Harry Potter, and maybe you don't, in fact, want the main character to be the most interesting character in the story. Maybe it would be a little distracting if they were. To get away a bit from Harry Potter, I'm going to talk briefly about one of my favorite fantasy stories, the ElfQuest comics, which was a pivotal story to me when I was young. And the main character, Cutter, he was obviously the favorite of the creator, Wendy Pini. She said he was, and you could just feel the love she had for Cutter on the page. I didn't really care for Cutter that much, though. I was more into, like, the weirdos. My favorite was Tildak, the winged elf guy. There are certainly, like, I have met people whose favorite character is Cutter, so I'd say she did a pretty decent job with him. But to me, Cutter was just, like, kind of boring, had kind of a typical backstory where, like, his dad was the chief and he'd gotten killed kind of tragically fighting, like, this monster, and now Cutter was the chief, and, he's got a love story and he's got a quest, but I just, like, wasn't that into him. Maybe someday the cats will let me finish this video without just making me get up to let them in and out of the room a million times. Hello, baby. Oh, let everybody see how cute you are. I do feel like it was totally fine that I wasn't that into Cutter. It didn't affect the story. I still loved the story, and I didn't hate Cutter or anything. That to me would be where you have a problem if the main character is supposed to be likable and is actively just irritating, which, that does happen. There's that kind of too stupid to live stereotype, particularly with female main characters, which might just be a certain level of misogyny, but either way, I've certainly read some stories where I kind of wanted to strangle the main character. And some writing advice would say that that's part of the point for the main character to be a little boring, that they are more of a stand-in for the reader than someone who's supposed to be interesting in their own right. Like in Star Wars, I definitely prefer Han, Leia, various other characters to Luke Skywalker, but that doesn't mean I dislike Luke Skywalker, and I don't have any notes. I think that Luke works perfectly fine for the main character arc that he is in. I don't know that the story would have been better if Luke had more interesting or quirky attributes. So sometimes you might be worrying about making a character interesting, and they don't need to be. They just don't need to be. The side characters are what's important as far as like adding that little spice to the dish, and your main character is just the potatoes. But another point that I wanted to make about why main characters might seem a little boring, not only do they have to pull the weight of like some kind of classic plot structure, in at least in many types of stories, but I think one reason that fantasy novels tend to be the culprit for the boring main character has something to do with, this is something that I have noticed because recently I have been working on this story, The Court of the Last Dragon Queen. It takes place in my fantasy world, but it is the earliest story in the timeline when the kingdom still, it's very much more of like a medieval Renaissance kind of vibe compared to later stories where the world is getting more modern. Like they have a little pop culture in the form of theater shows and books, but it's, you know, it's back in the day. It's not like they're rocking out or anything. They don't have television. And B, we don't really know their culture. The best way to like explain their culture to you is that as you're reading it, you're probably going to relate it to more typical medieval or Renaissance settings in high fantasy, as well as it kind of has a little bit of like an ancient China flavor to it maybe. And it's set in like very much a court with the king and queen being some of the major characters. So that really makes their life paths very rigid. They can't just like go off and be too weird, or at least if they were, then, you know, that would have like major consequences for how the story was going to unfold. And like the original commenter, this is a story where I had the plot first and then I had to kind of fill in who these people were, because this is essentially a prequel. And as I was writing this story, I've struggled with making the characters feel as quirky and fun, and I'm using that word quirky too much, but you know what I mean, like that it factor. I was struggling to give the characters as much of an it factor. And part of it, I feel, is that the society they're in is just more removed from ours, and a lot of like little bits of like how we relate to each other in the modern world come from culture and society. And therefore, if you're like, the farther you go back in the past, so to speak, the harder it is to make your characters feel kind of more unique. Like think about setting a novel in like an Ice Age vibe, tribal society. What kind of characters you're going to populate your Ice Age tribe with? It just feels like you don't have as many options, at least to me. Like, you know, they're going to be somewhat preoccupied with survival. Their hobbies are going to be kind of limited. Like they're, you know, nobody's going to be like opening an Etsy shop for, you know, embroidering. And the types of characters that are going to appear in the story might also feel kind of limited just because of like the setting. And like, so you can't have a character that's like really funny, for example. Like what joke are they going to make that would actually make the modern reader laugh out loud? They could be sort of making merry amongst themselves, but it's very hard to write laugh out loud funny stuff when you're way back in time and there's like no pop culture and there's no like sort of, the society is very different and you don't have as much of like the relatable types. So then we move forward and we get to an author like Jane Austen. She was writing in her actual time, and her books are very funny at times. Depending on how easily you laugh out loud and how much you relate to the Regency period, they might even be laugh out loud funny to you. There's probably moments that are at least like, that's amusing. Like, she's funny. But I think part of the reason that Jane Austen can be funny is that she was writing about real people, kind of, a real time frame, and like all the society that's around her. And some of it we can still relate to this day. But she really knew that world, so she's able to draw out the humor in it because she was living it. If you yourself are trying to write a Regency historical or fantasy, the more you really understand the Regency, the more able you are to make your characters complex and interesting, and for their interactions with each other to seem interesting, maybe funny, maybe just very relatable, because it's like the more you know about that culture, the more you can draw out like a lot of different things from it, and your main character becomes more interesting because they just embody such a rich world. I don't know if other people find this to be true, but that's just how I feel. Like the closer I get to sort of the modern world, but also somewhat a world that I know, even if it's not entirely modern, the more I feel comfortable making the main characters quirky, or actually all the characters. So if you're writing a book and your main character feels boring and it just feels like you're adhering to some more classic structure, like farm boy finds out he's a prince and he's just not that interesting, how would you spice that up? These are my best thoughts. First, I do feel that the more you develop the world, the more you allow it to be its own thing, the funnier and weirder and more interesting your main character might become by default. When I think of like Avatar: The Last Airbender, I feel like all the characters in that story were pretty quirky and interesting, including like the main characters. And that story let itself kind of develop its own vibe, and also was able to nod to some things that would be like funny and relatable and weird to a modern reader, but while still keeping it within the bounds of this more ancient sort of Asian setting. So if you're writing a fantasy, you have some freedom to come up with like some little quirky bits of culture or society, and maybe thinking about ways that your character could sort of be unique within the context of their fantasy world. And allow them to have some like unusual relationships or unusual interests or, what have you. The other thing is, if the story is more plot driven, I would try to put some pauses in that story where you're just letting the characters be characters. It doesn't have to be like a cozy story, but allowing like cozy moments within the story where you kind of stop and let the characters just be characters. That really helps. It doesn't just help. It forces you to think like, who is this person? Like if the story stops for a second, if you put the brakes on the plot, who the heck is this person? What are they doing? When I did my last video about improving boring characters, someone suggested writing the character into like a totally different setting that has nothing to do with the plot at all. And if you're struggling, you might want to try that one. But I would just like, okay, let's say they get held up in some kind of quirky little situation in some town. What could happen? What could you have them do that is not part of the plot that would still be interesting? And if you can't think of anything, then maybe you want to go back to the drawing board and ask yourself, who even is this person? The third thing is like, maybe just make it an ensemble cast and don't make the main character be the main character. Avatar and Lord of the Rings are both examples of stories where, you could say Frodo's the main character, but Aragorn is also very much in kind of a main character placement. Or in Avatar, you start with Sokka and Katara as like the point of view, then Aang kind of becomes the main character, and then Zuko's even kind of the main character for a little while. Like if you're more willing to switch up point of views and let like more than one person be the main character, it takes some weight off the main character so that maybe we see them through different eyes, or we allow them to do something a little less main character-ish. Like with Harry Potter, I feel like if that had been like a multi-point of view story, we would have such a different vibe of how that unfolded. In fact, I feel like it would just have to unfold differently by default. But if it had, maybe it wouldn't have been as popular, which, the fourth point here is, do you even need to worry about this? Maybe it's fine. Maybe just embrace that your main character is an archetype and they're kind of boring. Maybe Bella Swan can just have her truck and she doesn't need any other personality besides being in love with a vampire. Maybe that's what made that story work. Sometimes that's okay. Even if that story is not for you, there's all kinds of different stories. And I think in some stories, having a boring main character is actually what works. Do you have any other tips or thoughts on how to make a main character, especially in a fantasy novel, more interesting that I didn't think of? Please drop them in the comments. And also, if you have favorite characters in fantasy novels, especially ones with kind of a classic structure that are more plot driven but have a really good main character, drop that in the comments as well. I'll admit I haven't even read as many fantasy novels as I really should, because when it comes to reading, I am all over the place. I like nearly every genre: fiction, nonfiction, manga, graphic novels, regular novels, kids' books. I'm like just so all over the place that I haven't read deeply in like any particular genre. So there's a lot of stories that I'm not familiar with, and feel free to share those here. If you want more from me, I also have a Patreon and a Substack. Same content on both, and those both get you access to my Discord server and bonus videos every month, or you could join my YouTube membership. And if you're interested in reading any of my fantasy novels and supporting the channel, there is a link in the description to all of them. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye! Here's my baby. Yeah, look at you. Look at you.